33 days, exactly this number of days the city was occupied. On its streets, Russians were committing mass atrocities. Today, we will show you the real witnesses of the tragedy. You will hear Bucha speaking. Valentina Vasilyevna left Bucha on March 9th. She will never forget the day when the war started. I was born here. Aircrafts were flying. It is because Hostomel Airports is nearby. All kinds of aircrafts flew here, and we got used to it, but when the military planes flew overhead and we heard the explosions, we understood it was a war. Look at this fence, and you can imagine how big the hole had to be so it could accommodate a big howitzer. The hole was huge, about 1 or 2 meters deep, and then when Russians shot those people, it was an older couple of our age perhaps, Natalia and Victor Mazocha. The couple saw a wounded girl and rushed to help, but the occupants shot all 3 of them. Today it all seems to me like a terrible dream, just like a terrible dream. In the 21st century, that such things could really happen, I can't fathom that. When Valentina in March heard about the Green Corridor, she firmly decided to leave her home. As she was passing checkpoints, she saw faces of those who committed murders, saw bodies laying exposed in the energetic street. I had such a feeling when we were waiting there for 4 hours and I saw those monsters who looked so full of themselves. I had the feeling that if I had any weapon on me, I would not be afraid of anything anymore. When you're 70 years old, you have nothing to fear. Russians broke into her home, stole everything, wreaked havoc, drank alcohol there. When I returned, you know, animals don't leave such a mess in their barrows. I don't know what I should call them, but I can't call them humans. We make homemade wine from grapes. My husband is from Odessa, and in 2021 we made the wine, filled 140 bottles and corked them. All that stayed in the basement, also the jars with jam and pickles. When we returned, we found only 1 bottle out of 140. Our son took it and said, "We will open it to celebrate our victory." Having heard that Russians produced their own propaganda film Witness, she says, "Spineless, merely spineless. This propaganda, which costs them hugely, it simply turns people into zombies." Such zombies knocked on the door of Petro Vasilyevich, who stayed during the whole occupation in his hometown, which was almost a haven before the war.
Bucha. It was a green city, a beautiful city. We lived almost next door to Europe. Everyone had an apartment, a car, a job, and some money, enough to afford a vacation abroad. And like a cold shower, all this, it's hard to remember. It's hard to think about those events. Knocking on the gate. After knocking, they tried to open the gate with a crowbar. I said, "Wait, don't break it, I'll open." 6 men entered. 2 stood there, 2 more here, and the last 2 behind. Our dog was barking. He said, "Silence it, or I'll shoot it." But the dog refused to leave, sensing something, you know. "Who is it at home?" they asked. "Me, my wife and a dog," I said. "Are there any Nazis?" he asks. "Which Nazis?" I said. "Americans." I looked closely at their faces. Young green conscripts.
Who were they?
From Bucha.
Military vehicles were quick to move into the houses abandoned by fleeing people. Business as usual was to steal everything.
My neighbor left, so they stole even children's stuff, women's t-shirt, and loaded it onto an armored personal carrier. They mainly stole a generator, expensive tools, chainsaw and washing machines. They loaded it onto a Ural truck, while me and my wife stood watching. And they said, "You are so wealthy. You have everything, asphalt roads everywhere, toilets. We would have lived even better if you had not come." They were like from a jungle. Saw solar panels and asked, "What is that?"
Unfortunately, they came not only to steal. The Russian tank had a very clear destination, and its crew had clear orders to leave no witnesses.
At the street nearby, my neighbor decided to stay home while his wife with kids tried to leave. She went to Chkalova Street and they were shot point blank. Just 3 houses from ours. He still lives there alone. Oleg is his name. It's terrible, unbearable.
The walls of the Holy Apostle Andrew, the first called church, still keep scars of the war. The place became a communal grave. 116 bodies were exhumed here.
I can't enter this place because of the tragedy that happened here. There was a ditch here. It was dug by a tractor. Bodies were put in and covered with soil. Put in and covered.
The killed people were buried near the church because the road to the graveyard was under occupants' fire control. Besides, there were cases when occupants booby-trapped the bodies.
The last time we tried was around March 16-17. The occupiers attacked our vehicle on the way to the graveyard. Our driver survived, but we decided not to risk it anymore. First sappers worked and after the police and investigators.
Father Andrew, parson of the local church, serving here since 1996, stayed in town until the middle of March. Occupiers paid him a visit as well.
It was impossible to provide church services because since February 27th it was shelled. You still can see the marks on the walls. We replaced the windows, but back then it was dangerous to gather people and conduct services.
There were broken windows inside the church. Russians were stationed on the premises. Bodies of the victims could not be identified. There was an unbearable stench in the churchyard. In fact, people were brought here en masse for temporary burials until mid-March, because then the Russians occupied the church.
You can clearly see through the windows that there is nothing here. There was no iconostasis, but they climbed in here and went down to the lower church. There are traces of them trying to break the door, but either they didn't have time or the door was too solid, so they didn't enter the lower church. They were always on the territory of church. There were benches there. Chechens were here. Burats were here.
After the liberation of Bucha, representatives of the International Court of Justice arrived here, including Karim Khan, who has issued the warrant for Putin's arrest.
The stench of corpses. These people who took out the bodies, a monument should be erected in their honor. About 40 experts, criminalists and prosecutors from this court. They brought with them a DNA laboratory, which was a lifesaver for us, because all those who were looking for their relatives had their DNA test taken.
Even a year later, these tests identify unknown victims. It is important for us not just to identify them, but to transfer everything to the International Court of Justice in accordance with the procedures, because the Russians tried, in every way, to hide the traces of their crimes.
A very vivid example is the singer of our church, Andriy Shapilo, 33 years old, who sang Whom I Saw Every Sunday and knew very well. And then he died on Ivan Franko Street. His whole family died. The Russians tortured them to such an extent that in order to hide the traces of the crimes, they threw them in a pile and set them on fire. The feeling of horror came in a year or maybe 3 months later. Because when we were doing it, there was no time to think about trivial things, like whether you would survive. You just go and you don't even think that there may be a sniper there. You just have a task to accomplish. Here you came and you don't know, every day is the same. It started with the meetings, so everyone came. How many are alive? Who is killed? What is the information from the districts?
The war caught Leonid Yefimovich at home. The next day, he and his colleagues were already at the Territorial Recruitment Center. Later, when reinforcements arrived, he volunteered at the city council.
We were already trying to get some weapons. 2 machine guns, ammunition, and we arrived at the Bucha guard station. On February 28th, I was in Bucha, and on February 28th, we hid our weapons, because we were surrounded. Later, there was a skirmish on Vokzalna Street. There were already the first dead and wounded. Then we helped with humanitarian issues on the territory of the city council.
Someone had to organize the distribution of medicines and coordinate the war. That's why, when the occupiers first came to the city council, the conversation didn't go well.
There was no fear. It appears only when you understand who are you dealing with. We didn't know who we were dealing with. We knew that no one else would do it but us. That's it. You just have to do it. Where is the mayor? Where is the territorial defense? Where are the weapons? What are you doing here?
Then arrests began. On March 15th, Russian special forces surrounded the city council.
We had a command center there. We worked there. They packed us up, tied our hands and faces with scotch tape, and put us against the wall. The officer took me to the interrogation separately and beat me up and said, "Do you remember me?" I remember his voice, but my eyes and hands were tied with tape, so I couldn't see him. But he was shouting, "You lied, we caught you, the territorial defense." He put a machine gun to my head and said, "That's it, take them to another place." Then they led us through Bucha with tied hands, about 300 meters. Such long 300 meters. We stayed in the yard until nightfall.
Meanwhile, Russians changed their shift, and our guys decided to go back to negotiations.
My friend is taking off the tape and says, "I know you." And I take it off and say, "I know you too. I've been watching you for 3 days. What you do?" A tall Buryat came out and said, "We don't need them." And we realized it was a chance.
Now, hearing that the occupiers are making their next false movie, he has only one answer.
We should not say anything to Russians. We just should kill them with missiles. We showed the princes and nephews of the British king the photos. They couldn't even drink a tea. So strong the emotion was. I'll tell you honestly, the energy of life has not come back to the city yet.
There are hundreds of stories like this. Across the street from the church, there lived a family that fled the war in Donbass in 2014.
They settled here, raised their children, worked, so then around March 5th, they tried to leave Bucha. The grandmother stayed, and the father, mother, 2 children, and maybe some relatives left in 2 cars. And they were all shot by a Russian armed assault vehicle. On March 20th, the remains of those children and the mother were reburied, because the father survived, and the mother and children were burned. And I saw them being exhumed right in front of their house, and they were lifted up in a blanket. It's very hard.
2 deep ditches in which human bodies were buried. There were someone's mother, father, and child.
When you listen to Lavrov, who says that they appealed to the UN to give them the names of people who died, but we were given nothing. So come here. There are a lot of people who died here, and all of them are local. For us, these are not just bodies, statistics, these are real people, our closest ones. Of course, no one has seen such a nightmare. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican Communion, Justin Welby, came to us. He says, "I've been to Rwanda. There were ethnic crimes there too. But in the center of Europe, in the 21st century, in the civilized world, I never seen anything like this.
Having heard about the new film being prepared by the Russians, it's incredible how much they continue to brainwash people.
To listen to the Russian is absurd. That we shoot our own relatives just to make a movie. Any lie will end sooner or later. After all, we are fighting for our land, for our freedom, for our children. But they came because of myth they were told about some sort of Jewish Bandera cannibals and boys being crucified in their underwear. They believed in these myths and paid the price. How many of their mothers and wives were left without husbands, without children?
And whatever the machine of Russian terror continues to sow, it is important for us to hold on.
Something else is important for me and for the people who live here. For us, it is important to win.
In reality, the Russians will create their false narrative, but in it, they won't tell about the local priest who was tortured to death.
The priest who started the parish many years ago in the early 19th lived in Bucha and served in Kiev. And when the Russians came in, they shot him and threw his body into a garage pit.
They won't tell you about the horrors of Yablonska Street and how death lingered in the air every hour. This street is colloquially called the Street of Death, Yablonska. Ahead is the road to Warsaw, behind is the road to Irpin. These were the towns that the Russians wanted to capture in order to pave the way to Kiev. The highest number of people were killed on Yablonska Street.
Here is Volodymyr Borovchenko, whose story I was telling you. Here I can't see his face. I see this picture and only half of a year later I read about him. From time to time, our city council makes posts about the deceased on Facebook. I look at his lifetime photo and realize that I knew him well.
The most notorious torture site footage of which has been seen all around the world, Yablonska Street. Here was the command center of the occupiers, and behind its walls, people were executed. We have already shown you one command center where the occupiers were. You will not believe it. On the premises of a child care center, they installed another one. There was a command center. On the premises there was a sound machine. Whether it was intercepting or jamming, I don't know. On top, Russians were sitting in a large room on the second floor. We were not allowed to go further, so we didn't see. In the first days of the war, this child care center accommodated about 400 people. Nobody could think that the peaceful premises where civilians lived would be invaded by occupiers' vehicles. Victoria lived through the beginning of the occupation in this child care center, already without power or natural gas. I have two boys, and it was written all over my husband's face what impact it had on him. I tried to hold myself together for the sake of our sons, to show that everything was okay, everything was fine. They probably chose this side because the windows here overlooked the entire alley and offered a good view. Here stood APCs, here was a sound machine. From here they came in, and from there they drove in. Here were blown away. Knocked on the door. Who? Ours. They came in, shined with their flashlights, and as they came in, I was sitting in the second row with a child in my arms. These were Russians. The one who spoke to the child had a beard. I haven't seen him since. Here, there were nothing else left to do but to die. You couldn't move neither here nor there, because there they stood and watched you with machine guns pointed at you. Here is our shelter now. Clean, where about 400 people lived. Children's beds were brought down here from upstairs, folding beds. I remember which family was here. Here, a nightstand was put for grandma. Chairs were put together and mattresses were put on top. Children hung blankets and played with their toys. Pity that they had grown up so early, from a childhood, so to speak. Now that the yard is cleaned and neat, but earlier Russian vehicles messed up everything. Here are even some traces left. To make it easier to drive out, they dropped the Scaropilo track, so 2 rows were lying down, and they brought the second half of it down to the basement. I don't even know how many people pulled it. I wish that they have the same staging so everything would come back to them nicely. Miss Olena from Vokzal Street was probably saved because she was here in the childcare building, because her apartment was completely destroyed and looted by Russians. And here, during the war, the woman was cooking. To feed some 400 people was not a small task, when all the utilities were already disconnected. This is why she cooked outside, under Russian machine guns. The cooking began at 6 a.m. and until lunchtime the meal was not ready, but kids and people were asking for food, so we gave them some snacks. I was forced to move people to the basement so they didn't see deliveries of artillery shells. Miss Olena so shot people on her Vokzalny street. But here, she remembered one boy who was burned into her memory. On the 8th, they were holding a boy in the gazebo, underdressed, in the cold and snow. They only let him sit down and get up. I approached the Russians and asked if I could give him at least a hot tea. They replied, "Do you want to stand next to him?" By the morning, the boy was gone. The damn Russians who came to our land. I hate these people. On March 9th, when a green corridor was opened, Miss Halina, together with her daughter, left Bucha, but what she saw will forever stay with her for the rest of her life. Similarly, the atrocities will not be forgotten by the residents of village Mirotsky, which is 10 kilometers from Bucha. Russians shot dead Sofia's son in the family's own yard on March 2nd. I will never forgive them for killing my son. You cannot express this situation in words. How on earth can a person enter their own yard or barn on a tank and dot? People from Chechnya could not speak even Russian. Who are you? And who are you? I asked. I just moved forward. I thought that maybe I could be killed. Like my son. They are not humans. They are not a civilization. They are nobodies. I could not grasp how they could come to kill and level everything to the ground. I don't understand how I managed to survive.
We saw everything. The most terrifying thing was being surrounded by 15 men and asked where a grenade launcher was. It was not staged. These were real events, and they killed people.
Time will pass, but Bucha will remain an open wound on Ukraine's body. It will start to heal only when those guilty of war crimes face international court.